In the last video, we spoke about how we're going to replace our arrays with mappings in the goal of solving some of the scalability issues of our contract. The first thing we're going to do inside of our campaign contract is to replace the approvers array variable right here. So we don't want to work with this array of addresses anymore. We want to work with a mapping instead, because with a mapping, we can add as many different values that we want to this thing, and we don't have to worry about taking a long time to loop through it in the future, because we always get the benefit of that constant time lookup. Now, to give you a good idea of what this variable is going to look like after we refactor it right now, let's look at a quick diagram. So here's our contract. We're going to define a mapping where the keys are addresses and the values are booleans. And we're going to call that mapping the approvers variable, exactly what we call it right now. The keys of this mapping are going to be addresses of people who donate to our contract. And then the values will always be a boolean that will always set to true. True indicates that this person has in fact donated to our contract. Now you might be curious, why are we marking this thing specifically like as true? Why don't we do like false or something like that? Well, remember we spoke about just a moment ago with respect to default values inside of a mapping. So whenever we try to access a value inside of a mapping, we say that all values exist. And if we try to access a key that we have never worked with before, we'll get back some default value. In the case of type boolean, the default value is false. That means that if we at some point in time tried to look up an address of say like 0xab8519, which clearly does not exist inside this mapping, if we looked up this address inside this mapping right here, we would get back a boolean of false, rather than anything like say undefined or null or anything like that. So we're specifically putting true here so that we can actually differentiate when we are accessing an address that already has been defined inside the mapping. Now, the last thing I want to remind you here, inside this diagram, I'm showing a listing of these addresses. But to be clear, again, we don't actually store these addresses or these keys with the mapping at all. So they don't actually exist. Instead, we have some type of kind of abstract mapping here that says, well, if you plug in address 80x1787, that would map over to this value of true right here. So although my diagram might show these addresses, they don't actually exist inside the mapping. All right, so let's do this refactor now. So back inside of our contract, I'm going to find the approvers line. We're going to delete that entire line, and we're going to replace it with our new mapping definition. We've already seen the syntax for defining a mapping several times, whether or not you've actually realized it. So define a mapping, we write out the keyword mapping. We write the type of key that we want to have. So that's going to be an address for us. And then we write out a big arrow and then the type of value. And in this case, we want to have a boolean. We can then write out public, and then we'll label the variable like it was before as approvers. Now, immediately after doing this, we'll see an error message appear down inside of our contribute function. Inside of here, we're trying to call approvers.push. Push is a method that is only available to arrays, not to mappings. So we need to now refactor this line right here to work with a mapping rather than an array. Notice how right now we're taking the address of the person who is sending in this transaction and adding them to the approvers array. So we want to make sure that we add this address to our mapping and give it a value of true. And that will mean that if we ever look up this address inside the mapping in the future, we'll get back a value of true and know that this person has in fact donated to our contract. So let's delete this line. To work with mappings, we use syntax very similar to JavaScript objects. So we can write out approvers, we can write out our square braces, just like we would with JavaScript, and then we put inside of here the key that we're trying to access. So we're trying to look up the key of message.sender, like so. And we're going to set that thing's value to be true. So this adds a new key of this address to the approvers mapping and gives it a value of true. Now, just one last time, I want you to remember this address does not get stored inside the mapping. Only the value true actually does. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now at any point in the future, we can very easily check to see if someone has contributed to our contract by writing one simple line of code. For example, if we want to make sure that in order to call create request, you have donated to the contract, we could add a line of code inside of here that simply says require approvers message.sender. This will look up our approvers mapping. It will try to access the key of this address inside of it. If that person has donated to our campaign, this entire little block right here should return true. And then we're going to require that that is in fact true. So if this person has not been added to the approvers mapping, it'll return false, require will fail, and they'll get kicked out of this function entirely. So as you can see right here, this is a lot easier to work with for doing existence checks like the one we want than the kind of for loop that I had showed you previously over right here. So rather than writing this complex for loop right here that might cost some variable amount of gas for every entry inside the array, we write that one simple little block right here to do the entirely same exact thing. So this is exactly why we are using a mapping rather than an array to store all those addresses. Okay, now we don't actually need this check inside the create request function, so I'm going to take that out. It was just a quick for example. So that little refactor there looks good. Now the next thing we're going to do is to refactor our request struct up here to add in the idea of keeping track of who has voted on a particular request as well. And just like we did with approvers right here, we're going to use a mapping for that as well. So quick pause, and we'll take care of that in the next video.